This is a special report from the Boston Red Network. A new dawn in US Cuban relations. President Obama announced from the White House that the U.S. would pursue full diplomatic relationships with the government of Cuba. Also, President-The Castro announced the same to the Cuban people. You'll hear later in our broadcast prepackaged from President Obama, from Comandante Reyes Castro, and from the released prisoner Alan Gross, a former subcontractor for the AID. The AID has had a checkered history throughout its past as a den of spies. We'll leave it at that. And also some Cuban prisoners were released from the U.S. Thus, this day is a very happy day for Mr. Gross, no doubt. He is released on the second day of Hanukkah, if my calendar is correct here. So thus he rejoiced. He supports the Obama administration. You'll also hear from the epicenter, Little Havana, as they call it. The presidential nominee, John Jeb Bush, spoke about it. He had very little to say about it. And some other officials in Florida and residents of Little Havana. The latest polling is from Little Havana, this is by the Cuban Institute, that roughly 48% of the Cubans support relations as they are. That's in Little Miami, that is, Havana. But times have changed, and President Obama has changed the policy, as he so eloquently pointed out, that the Castro government has been in Cuba, and the Cuban Communist Party has been there since the late 50s. This embargo was to address those days. Those were days that the U.S. was under apartheid. Dr. King was marching throughout the South, and African Americans had not gotten the vote. That came later, under Lyndon Johnson in the 60s. They had the Cuban embargo, the missile crises, and the missile crisis was a crisis brought about by the U.S. What basically happened there was the Soviet Union at the time had placed defensive weapons in Cuba to counter nuclear weapons that were aimed at the Soviet Union in Germany. A bargain was struck between the Kennedy administration and the then premier and chair of the Communist Party, Nikita Khrushchev, that he would remove these nuclear weapons from Florida, and that the U.S. would remove nuclear weapons from Germany. You don't hear that part of the story, but that was the story. Now, the Cubans did not have control of those missiles that were being built there, and they were being built there for defensive purposes, not offensive purposes. But the U.S. was going to war. I can remember it as a grade schooler at the time that the nation was panicked. Now, the nation did not have internet service at the time of the missile crisis, nor did the nation have 24-hour news, so it was different. You heard your news on the radio, you got it from the Globe, the Times, or whatever newspapers that you read at the time, and from, if I'm a little shaky on this, it was either the 15-minute newscast from Walter Cronkite. It went to a 30-minute newscast, but that was the news that you got, unless you got a special bulletin, as the case when President Kennedy was assassinated. We'll do a little bit of a news roundup here, starting, we just start with the Washington Post. Washington Post has an article here, what you will do and won't be able to do now that President Obama has opened up Cuban relationships. You will be able to go to Cuba if you're a business. You always were able to do that. An NGO, you can go there to Cuba. If you have family in Cuba, you can also go to Cuba. And you can return with $100 worth of Cuban cigars and rum. Or you can get them in Canada, Peru, elsewhere where we get them occasionally. But nonetheless, a Cuban economy is about $71 billion. That's half of the rural state of Iowa. So you can understand, Cuba is a very small nation. It's not a large nation at all. And it's a very small island. But it was made a major political football during the Cold War. And this is one of the problems with the foreign policy of Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson was the president. He was instrumental in the League of Nations at the time, and also that was the forerunner for the UN. But his policies at home, he came from the president of Princeton. He was an avid supporter of the Confederacy. His wife was a Confederate Southerner. He was a sympathizer. He was a racist. And thus that leaked into the American foreign policy, and it has been there to this day. Thus that is where you are there. And also the amount of money that Cubans in Miami and elsewhere can send is $2,000 rather than $500 now. And little is said about whether they will be allowed to buy real estate. And this is one of the situations that we have looked at, the ability of Cubans now in the U.S. to help their relatives establish businesses. One of the big problems there is a racial divide, and the Cuban government's working on that particular situation, because most of those Cubans classify themselves as white, whereas Afro-Cubans, a very large amount of people in Cuba, would not be able to get that type of financial assistance. So thus the normalization of relations have started. This is one more, as they say, nail in the Republican coffin, and John Jeb Bush knows that. He had very little to say today because he knows that day is gone. Al Jazeera has here President Obama trumpets a new chapter on Cuba, hit reset on diplomatic relationships, and goes on to talk about the Cubans that were freed here that had been literally in jail, I believe, 50 years, called the Cuban Five. And let's see, a comment here from Marco Vivas Rubio. He's a Cuban that is in the Senate. He says the announcement today initiating a dramatic change in U.S. policy towards Cuba is just the latest in a long line of failed attempts by President Obama to appease rogue regimes at all costs. The move would put U.S. national security at risk, represents a terrible setback for the hopes of all oppressed people around the globe. He's living in Disneyland. In fact, what this will actually do will open Cuba up, and it's unfortunate because this will give the American corporate interests greater influence in Cuba. In other words, there are pluses and minuses to this. Cuba will get better internet service there. They now have a fiber optic cable, I believe, is coming, but is there from an Italian company. And Cuba has an initiative, we'll talk about this on the open source report, to literally wire up Cuba. And if Cuba gets the money to do what they need to do, they will have high-speed internet service like Vietnam and several other places, Thailand, than what we do here in the U.S. Now, the survey I referred to was the Cuban Research Institute at Florida International University. Only 48% of the Cuban Americans favor the embargo. That was it used to be 87% in 1991, very long time ago. The Cuban Five were announced the release of 3 members of the so-called Cuban Five. Now, the Cuban Five have been in jail for a very, very long time. So thus, President Obama has hit another milestone in international relations that have not been done. So we looked there. Several newspapers have talked about it, from the Associated Press, the Cuban Five. We'll just go to the Washington Post and grab this. Several of these people confirmed that Cuba has freed American citizen Alan Gross. We'll hear from him. And release is a culmination of more than a year of secret back channel. Incidentally, Pope Francis and the Vatican were involved in this. 3 members of the Cuban Five were released. Their name, Guillermo Hernandez, Antonio Guillermo, and Ramon LeBlanc. They were part of a Cuban Five, a group of Cuban nationals convicted of spying in 2000. This is in 2001. The other members, Rene Gomez and Fernando Gomez, have already been released, respectively there. It was a frame-up job that is part referred to as the WASP network. They infiltrated anti-Castro groups there. They were carrying citizens working picture with the exile group Brothers to the Rescue. And it gives the details of the people that were released there in Cuba. There was also the WASP network had been credited with bombings. It was a Tropicana nightclub in Havana. There's been a long list of various bandits. If you recall, even in Watergate, there were some of these Cuban types that were involved there. The Drudge Report, that's one of these right-wing gossip things. Obama to release 3 Cuban spies. Well, they weren't much as spies. They were framed up. And finally, we'll go to the BBC before we move on to President Obama, Comandante Castro. They just call it a new chapter in US Cuba ties. This is from the BBC in London. So basically that is where they are. So we'll move to that, and we'll have more of the domestic reaction and impact on Boston Red, which can be heard on many of the same channels. From us, good day.
Good afternoon. Today, the United States of America is changing its relationship with the people of Cuba. In the most significant changes in our policy in more than 50 years, we will end an outdated approach that for decades has failed to advance our interests, and instead, we will begin to normalize relations between our two countries. Through these changes, we intend to create more opportunities for the American and Cuban people and begin a new chapter among the nations of the Americas. There's a complicated history between the United States and Cuba. I was born in 1961, just over 2 years after Fidel Castro took power in Cuba, and just a few months after the Bay of Pigs invasion, which tried to overthrow his regime. Over the next several decades, the relationship between our countries played out against the backdrop of the Cold War and America's steadfast opposition to communism. We're separated by just over 90 miles, but year after year, an ideological and economic barrier hardened between our two countries. Meanwhile, the Cuban exile community in the United States